Bridgen, it is wonderful to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
No, you're welcome.
Andrew Bridgen, of course, you can find him at Bridgen on Twitter, and he has served as Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire since 2010, re-elected 2015, 2017 and 2019 with a whopping 62% of the vote, one of the few MPs with anywhere near that. Obviously thrown out of the Conservative Party, the whip removed, and then that was in April 2023 for raising concerns on the COVID jab, and Andrew now represents the Reclaim Party in Parliament as an MP. Andrew, may I can ask you first, what got you into politics? You entered Parliament 2010. What made you think it would be a good idea to get into politics?
Frustration, Peter. I've been running a business for 22 years, which had started up with £1,000. So I've been MD and chairman of the company, and we built it up to a 25 million turnover company employing 300 people by 2006. I'd been interested in politics. I joined the Conservatives in 1983 at Nottingham University.
Wow.
And I'd been chairman of the Institute of Directors and on the council of the IOD in Pall Mall. And through working during the Blair years with the East Midlands Regional Assembly as a business member, obviously I'd met a lot of ministers, and I can't say that I was impressed. Well, it was pretty clear they were going to bankrupt us. A group of friends, they were all really sort of small and medium-sized business people and their wives. We used to meet at a pub locally, and every Friday night it was sort of Groundhog Day. So they always moaned about the state of the country. I'd given a reasonable donation to the Conservative Party in 2005, and I think we had a 0.5% swing to the Conservatives. So worked out at that rate we're never going to get rid of Tony Blair, and so they moaned every Friday night, and eventually it got to me. But I mean, by that time I was running a business that was making about £3 million a year across the group. I got a good management team. I had no debt whatsoever, and one pint of Marston's pedigree on a Friday night too many. And I said to this group of collected individuals, that's it then. It's no good relying on anybody else. There's only us. So in North West Leicestershire was supposed to be a rock solid Labour seat. The council, I don't think it had ever been Conservative controlled properly. I think they may have had control for about 3 months once out of 40 years after a by-election. So I said, well, you all stand for the council, the district council. I'll stand for MP. We'll take over, and we'll get it sorted. And to a man and a woman, every single one of them agreed. And so I put most of the money up for the campaign, and I got the nomination. Nobody really wanted to be the MP for North West Leicestershire, well, the candidate for North West Leicestershire, because the Conservatives told me we can't win North West Leicestershire, 83rd target seat. They also said they weren't giving me any money, but I said that's fine. I got my own money, and my factory was in the so I actually did have a payroll vote. So 300 people plus their families in the constituency. And the district council elections came round first in 2007, and I was already selected as the parliamentary candidate. I ran those elections and put the money up, and it was the first time the Conservatives had put a full slate up in the seat, and they said I was running them too thin. But I always thought, on the basis, if you didn't put a candidate up, it was at an election, it's very difficult to see how they're going to vote for somebody, aren't they?
Yep.
So we put a full slate of candidates up and took Labour down to 5 councillors out of 38 in one night. Wow. The biggest swing in the country in the district council elections in 2007. We took control of the council, obviously, and I had the second biggest swing against Labour in 2010. So I turned a rock solid 4,500 Labour majority with a much loved Labour MP, who sadly died, into 7,500 Conservatives at one, so I think a 12.5% swing. The seat's my home, and I'm very comfortable in North West Leicestershire, and we moved it to, in 2015 it went up to 11,200 majority, and despite Theresa May's best efforts in 2017 with her manifesto, which was appalling, I moved it up to 13,300 majority. And then in 19, I led the Leave campaign in the referendum for the East Midlands. And I'd told my seat that if they didn't back me, I would have to resign as their MP, because we didn't agree on the big issues. But to be honest, Peter, I was fairly sure they would. So the East Midlands voted 59-41 to leave, and my own seat voted 61-39. And I'm actually the MP who persuaded Boris Johnson to back Leave. He was no way that he was a natural Brexiteer. And also, if you look back on YouTube, you'll find that on the eve of the referendum, Boris Johnson came to my seat and went around Ashby de la Zouch. That's when I told him we were going to win, and you should have seen his face when I told him we were going to win. I don't think that wasn't actually part of the plan, Peter. And he tried to talk me out of it. He said, no, it's going to be close, but we're not going to win. I said, no, we're going to win tomorrow. No, it's going to be close. I said, well, maybe. I said, but certainly not round here. Not round here, it's not going to be close. The bit we're running. Yeah. So, and then in 19, on the Get Brexit Done election, which now seems so much happened since 19. It feels like a very long time ago, more than 4 years away. And I got a 20,400 majority. It was 62.8% of the vote.
Yeah.
And the BBC, I had no sleep that night. The next morning, the BBC interviewed me. And they said, Mr. Bridgen, you must be delighted. This is your fourth election victory. Each time you've increased your vote, you've increased your majority, your percentage of the vote. You must be delighted. I said, no, it's terrible, actually. They said, why is it terrible? I said, well, it's 9 years since I was first elected as the MP. I've delivered the highest economic growth in the country. We've taken the poorest constituency in Leicestershire and made it the richest, the only part of Leicestershire with above average UK salaries and wages. We've got the happiest place to live in the Midlands now, Colville, which was the most deprived town in Leicestershire. I said, and 1 in 3 of the electorate are still not voting for me. I'm going to have to work much, much harder.
Tell me about that whole Brexit battle. I mean, my time was UKIP, and UKIP was easy because 100% of Kippers were on board. The Conservative Party have always had that tension and division over Europe. What was that like actually in the Conservative Party, pushing something that wasn't necessarily what the Conservatives wanted?
Well, it wasn't what the establishment wanted. All the established parties were backing Remain. Yeah. I think it was interesting that the Conservative Party was like a very civilized internal war. And there were probably only a quarter to 30% of Conservative MPs who were for Leave. So still the majority were Remain or indifferent. And some of them were maintaining indifference, which, I mean, I don't know what you're into politics for. If a big question like whether we should remain or leave the European Union, they say, oh, I don't want to get involved in this. I'll just sit down and see what my people say. I mean, that's not exactly leadership, is it? I mean, I think that should be pretty much automatic deselection if you can't make your mind up on that sort of issue. And what comes back to mind is that the Conservative Party, we used to, when I was in the Conservative Party before they threw me out. Well, firstly, I'll tell you this: that Conservatives have never been encouraged in the Conservative Party. They're only ever tolerated. The Conservative Party, Parliamentary Party, had something called an away day every 2 years. and they pay for them in advance to get a good deal. And so despite the fact that there was this internal schism over the referendum that was coming, the party had paid for an away weekend in Oxfordshire at this basically hotel that's like a Bond villain's hideout with an underground lecture theatre. It was this very weird place, and because we paid for it, we were told it all got to go there, and this is only sort of 3 months before the referendum. Yeah. And we had a very civilised weekend of talking about policy, but no one mentioned the EU and no one mentioned the referendum over the whole 2.5 days and the dinner. But I do remember that Craig Oliver sat with me at the final dinner. He sat next to me on my table at the final dinner. And I told him, I said, have you got yourself another job lined up for when you lose? And he said to me, he said, that's fine. He said, if we win by 1 vote, that's it settled, and that's it done. I said, well, I'll be honest, I'll take that on, as long as it cuts both ways, if we win by 1. And I knew we were going to win, Peter, because I'd been around the East Midlands, and I could tell we were definitely going to win. But it was about driving the vote up, because it wasn't just winning by a seat. All the votes were cumulative, so every vote counted. Yeah. And what I'd sussed out is, in my seat and in the East Midlands, is that people who didn't normally vote were going to come out and vote. Yeah. They weren't, those people who didn't normally engage with politics, they weren't coming out to vote for the status quo. They were voting for change. Mm. So I concentrated my campaigning efforts the last 6 weeks, and did a lot of campaigning. And also I was running a load of field operatives who were 90% of it were UKIP. The Remain campaign had nobody on the ground willing to deliver leaflets, hardly at all for them. We were destroying them on the ground battle. Obviously the air campaign, we could only be responsive because they got all the media, they got all the established parties, and we were the insurgents. So that was more of a struggle, but on the ground we were doing very, very well. And what I'd sussed out was that people were going to come out and vote who didn't normally vote. And every time I saw the polls, I was not disappointed, because I knew that we'd probably got 5 or 6% better than the polls were saying. Because these people who were going to come out and vote, and they told me they were, and I believe they were, they're not engaged in politics. They're not on YouGov's polling panel. And when Comres or somebody else rang them up and they said, oh, well, I'm going to vote to leave the European Union, they'd say, well, did you vote in the last general election? No. Did you vote in the local? No. Did you vote in the one before? No. Have you ever voted? No. And they'd put them down as 0 chance of voting. Well, I knew as long as we got those people out, it was all going to come as a bit of a surprise to the Remain campaign. And so in North West Leicestershire, and we counted our votes, so I know I know exactly what the vote was in North West Leicestershire. We coterminous with my seat of North West Leicestershire until the next boundary changes. I think it was a sort of 75% turnout to get me in 2010, important election. And then ever since then, as my majority had gone up, the turnout had gone down, and it dropped to sort of 68.5% or something in 19. But I mean, it was a stonking massive majority. Mm. And obviously the referendum, I was very encouraged when it was nearly 80%. And I'd spent all my time in North West Leicestershire and across the East Midlands. In my villages, I mean, it's a general election, they turn out 85% anyway. I'm not going to squeeze much more out of those people. It's very hard to squeeze. They're on the second, third pressings of the pips. So I went to all the areas that normally turn out 50, 55, 60%, because there was plenty of low-hanging fruit. And, it was that turnout in North West Leicestershire and across the East Midlands, some people who didn't normally vote. And that's why we won. And that's why the polling was so wrong. And that's what people like David Cameron, who'd come to my seat in 2008 when he was leader of the opposition, and he really upset me, Peter. So I'm a candidate. Mm. We've just taken the council with the biggest swing in the country for the first time in living memory. And Cameron told me in front of constituents that my seat was a dump and it had never be Conservative.
Wow.
And they weren't giving me any money. And I said, well, I don't need your money. And to be honest, David, if that's your view, never, ever come to my constituency again, and I will win it.
Yeah.
And to be honest, David Cameron is a man of his word. He never came. He never came. So that's fine. And I think now my majority is bigger than Whitney. So, I mean, what a dump the Cotswolds must be. You know what I mean? North West Leicestershire, and we've gentrified.
Yeah.
So people used to say, Colville was a very poor place, and it didn't have a chance. And now it's Colville and proud. In fact, I'm speaking to you from Colville today.
I want to get on to the COVID discussion situation, but you talked at the beginning about having a business. And I guess part of your reason for getting into politics was you wanted the government to butt out. You want local businesses to be able to get on, not to have restrictions on them actually doing well, making money, employing people. What kind of other interests or passions?
I'd actually cut my teeth in politics when I was chair of the Institute of Directors, which they didn't like particularly because they were fairly pro-EU. Is that I got involved as a businessman in the Business for Sterling and the No campaign to keep the pound, so 25 years ago. Thank goodness we didn't join the euro, otherwise, I mean, it'd been much more difficult to extract ourselves. Yes, and Simon Wolfson, the chairman of Next, we used to meet at Enderby in his boardroom and plot Business for Sterling and the No campaign. So I suppose that's where I got involved, and a chap called Chris Eaton Harris, who's gone on to great things apparently. He was an MEP, and his father had a fruit and vegetable wholesale pitch in Covent Garden Market, and since I was into washing, packing, and distributing vegetables, mostly potatoes, nothing sexy. Chris was one of my customers. I used to buy potatoes from Mark Spencer.
Wow.
And Philip Dunn as well. They're farmers. So we had the whole supply chain between us. You know what I mean? But I made most of the money.
Which is just as well, because then that's into Parliament.
Just as well. So yeah, I wanted to put something back, and yeah, that's where we ended up.
Obviously, being a Brexiteer, there was backlash in the media. There was probably some pushback within the party itself. But I guess none of that even prepared you for the backlash whenever you addressed COVID tyranny. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, no, the 2 years under Theresa May were purgatory, quite honestly. I mean, I was a Spartan, so I voted 3 times against Theresa May's deal, which, it wasn't, some colleagues were conflicted, and there was, Steve Baker crying his eyes out. But I mean, there's nothing to cry about, because I've already voted against it twice. It hasn't got any better. And once you've come to the conclusion, which was the correct conclusion, that Theresa May's deal was constitutionally and democratically worse than being in the European Union, I mean, at least if you're in the European Union, you have a chance of leaving, whereas Theresa May's deal, we would be in vassalage forever and there's no way of leaving. Well, I mean, that's not a deal, not in my name. And that vote on the 3rd time Theresa May's deal came up before the Commons, I was pretty convinced that there were probably going to be 28 Conservatives in the no lobby. The rest of Parliament would vote yes, and that we would have been slung out of the Conservative Party within a few days. That was where I thought we were. Thank goodness. I mean, we always criticise Jeremy Corbyn, but he is a man of principle, and he is secretly a Brexiteer, really, I think. And he marched the Labour Party in behind us, and the rest, as they say, is history. But I mean, a politically savvy Keir Starmer would have taken Theresa May's deal and consigned us to EU vassalage. So thank goodness it was Jeremy Corbyn. But he did win the Conservatives the 19 election. It wasn't down to Boris. It was pure fear of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. No, it was, you don't want Corbyn. 100%. I remember that well.
Well, I actually had during that 19 election, I can remember when I was going around the doorsteps, two paid up locally members of the Labour Party came to me and said, I'll be voting Conservative. I can't vote for Jeremy Corbyn.
Wow.
And they actually told me they were paid up members of the Labour Party locally. Well, I mean, that is your core, ultra core vote. They weren't even voting for him.
Wow. On to the COVID, I've never seen anything in. I've loved politics forever with Northern Ireland parties, the DUP, and we've had Ian Paisley and Sammy Wilson on before, and then Conservatives, then over to UKIP. But nothing has divided people like what we've had in the last 3 years with the COVID tyranny. But you spoke a step. It wasn't just on the restrictions that we had, that civil liberty. But you also saw what was happening with harms and went on that. Kind of tell us about that, kind of how you worked that out, because that was a big step and that was an unacceptable step.
I think there's an element of destiny about all of this, Peter. When I was 18, and I'm the only member of my family that's been to university, I had a full grant because my parents weren't very wealthy, were poor. So about 2.5% of people went to university when I went in the 80s. And I went to Nottingham locally, but I studied biological sciences with biochemistry, specializing in genetics, virology, and behavior. Oh dear. And I don't know why, they were things I found quite fascinating. So I've tried to keep my knowledge up. So in February, when we'd had the 19 election, and then we had a sort of 6 weeks period, and then we had COVID, and everything changed.
Yeah.
Well, in the February, I was sent, and I looked through the scientific papers for the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine, its effectiveness against coronaviruses, and it was compelling. They were scientific papers, and because I've got my degree a very long time ago in those subjects, I can read them and I can understand the papers. And I sent the papers to Mark Spencer, Chief Whip, and said, the government need to look at this urgently. This could be very useful. And also sent them to Jeremy Hunt, who was at the time chair of the Health Select Committee. And I didn't get anything back from Spencer. And I also told Spencer, I said, you realise that I've got qualifications in all the areas that will be useful. If you want some help in the number 10 with someone who can actually read the papers and understand it and put it across politically, I'll be quite happy to help. They never asked me to help. And I rang up Jeremy Hunt a week later, and this shocked me, Peter, and it will shock your listeners. So I rang Hunt up and said, Jeremy, I sent you these papers. Have you looked at them? And he said, Andrew, don't send me scientific papers. He said, I don't understand them. And I said, but Jeremy, you're chairman of the Health Select Committee, and you were Health Secretary for 7 years. I said, what, you don't understand scientific papers? And what, you have no access to anyone who does understand them, who could actually explain them to you? And he put the phone down. And that was it. Wow. And so my suspicion, so I hadn't got a great deal of confidence. I did support the first lockdown because I don't think anybody knew, well, somebody knew what was going on. It certainly wasn't me. Was it 3 weeks to flatten the curve?
Yes.
Or 3. Anyway, so, and I was, from then on, things just didn't seem to stack up. The masks, I couldn't see the sense behind the masks. Those paper masks, they are to stop saliva from the doctors and nurses going onto the patient's wounds, and to stop blood and other bodily fluids squirting into the medics' mouths, which they don't really like. They don't like that. They're there for. So not to stop viruses and the gaps around the edges, and I was briefly in the military, and you know, if you had a full nuclear, biological, chemical suit, you've only got an 80% chance of keeping a virus out. Well, I mean, that's not what these paper masks are. And to be honest, I hate it. I hated putting them on anyway. They're horrible. So I was on that, and then the continuous lockdowns, and North West Leicestershire was chucked in with Leicester, and so we were locked down as much as anywhere in the country. It was completely unprecedented and unwarranted. I also really objected to the schools being closed, and I objected. I mean, they were making the children wear masks, and even some schools were making the children wear masks when it wasn't mandated, and none of this seemed right. And then I started speaking to some scientists who were speaking out about their concerns, and the fact that they were silenced, and they said, "Oh, the science is all settled." But I mean, we've heard that one before several times. I'm sure we'll hear it again. But I mean, science is never settled. It's a bit like politics. There's always another view, and if you can't defend your position, then there's something wrong. You know, every scientific thesis is open to challenge, or should be able to challenge, and most of them, I mean, half of everything that doctors are taught in medical school within 10 years will be proved to be completely wrong. That's a fact. I mean, that's just a fact. So, you know, the only constant is the evolution of science and new theories to supersede old ones, and saying that, you know, we're not having any debate about this and cancelling eminent scientists. Then my concerns grew and grew and grew. But I didn't want to believe the worst of the government. I actually am double vaccinated. They'll call me an anti-vaxxer, which is difficult when I'm vaxxed. I'm more the sort of concerned vaxxed, and I had two shots of AstraZeneca. I wish I'd had none, and I had a bad reaction after the second jab, which really hurt me. So I'd bitten my tongue. I'd also uncovered a lot of corruption around the PPE. My whistleblower was sacked. We uncovered £860 million worth of PCR tests that had disappeared from stock at Kuhn & Nagel with the distributor. We traced some of the unique barcodes, and they turned up in Berlin. They've been resold. So nearly £1 billion, and my whistleblower could only go back 12 months on his computer. And he was only in one of the 3 channels. He was in the channel to do with bulk, so it was only sort of prisons, schools, hospitals, things like that. But £860 million worth of PCR tests had gone missing, the taxpayer paid for. We took it to the government and the civil service. My whistleblower's computer was switched off on the day, and he was sacked within 7 days, no investigation. I was pretty annoyed. And I mean, the corruption of the Boris Johnson regime was the first one and he'd been the first prime minister I'd actually voted for, and I was feeling very betrayed. So I hadn't voted for David Cameron. Obviously, I voted for David Davis, and Cameron got in, and I didn't vote for Theresa May. She got in, and then Boris turned out to be as crooked as all the rest of them. So that wasn't good. And then, well, my pretty view on the vaccines and the mRNA technology, the messenger ribonucleic acid technology. I was working behind the scenes. Obviously, Matt Hancock had to go, and we had Sajid Javid became health secretary. But there are about 5 Conservative MPs who are qualified doctors. Well, Matt Hancock, not a good man, but he had said in the House of Commons that these vaccines were for adults, they weren't for children. So no one under 18 was going to have them. I know that every one of the doctors, qualified doctors, went to see Sajid Javid and told him not to use the experimental vaccines on under 18s. And he listened to all of them and then approved it. It's interesting that these two health secretaries are both leaving the Commons at the next election, isn't it? I wonder where I just wonder where they'll land. You know what I mean? I suspect, Peter, there'll be earning a lot more money than MPs get paid. Let's just put it that way.
They will.
then when the MHRA came out in November last year, and wanted to extend the experimental vaccines to babies down to 6 months of age, and I'll declare an interest. I've got a 5-year-old, and I thought, nah, I've got to speak out. And I knew there'd be a huge backlash from the party politically, and I knew the vested interests that were involved in it. But I also knew that it was probably going to cost me my position in the Conservative Party because they were so committed. But that I could win. That I'm pretty sure. I thought, well, there's no point doing it for nothing. You got to win. And I was pretty sure that I could put the science over that there were, no healthy child of that age had died anywhere in the world of COVID-19. So there was minuscule risk from the virus, but there was a risk from the vaccine. And I thought even the most pro-vaccine person I could persuade, that since the manufacturers still had immunity from prosecution, that there had to be a risk, but there was no risk for those children. I thought I could get that message across and we could actually do some good. And so I'd spoken out in a Westminster Hall debate in, I think it was October. And then on November the 13th, I secured an adjournment debate and blew the lid off the childhood vaccines vaccination with the experimental mRNA. And that night, my life changed. I was basically immediately cancelled by the mainstream media. And from that moment onwards, I had hundreds of thousands of emails from around the world from people who were telling me about the vaccine harms and the vaccine deaths that they were seeing. And that was it, really. So after that, although the government will say that I'm a conspiracy theorist, anti-science, anti-vax, and all the people who call me anti-science and everything, I mean, they haven't got any science degrees between them. And the fact is that our government was never able to approve those vaccines for healthy under fives, whereas all the other countries around the world did. So despite the fact that they said that I was talking absolute rubbish, they never bought the policy, and every other country did. And then we got round to sort of January, and the infamous tweet, which was actually, I mean, yes. So I retweeted. I actually didn't do it, but I mean, it was retweeted on my Twitter. A tweet from Dr. Josh Gutzko of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and it's fair to say that Mr. Gutzko is a Jewish gentleman. That he'd been told by a top cardiologist that the rollout of the vaccine was the biggest crime against humanity since the Holocaust, and the party seized on that. The Conservative Party seized on that to say I was an anti-Semite, and suspended me immediately from the party. I had a meeting at that time with a Conservative Party grandee who'd clearly been briefed by the party. We had an hour together in his office. I told him all of my concerns around the vaccine harms, the midazolam and morphine, the creation of the first wave of deaths by moving people out of care homes and then putting them onto the death pathway, putting them down with treating them with respiratory suppressants to give them the symptoms of COVID-19, which appeared on their death certificate, and they were pretty much all cremated very shortly afterwards, so there was no autopsies. And we had an hour of that. I also knew that the person I was meeting with, because I'd done my research and I'd got plenty of informers, he knew full well all of my concerns because he'd been told them. I also know that his sister had to go into hospital after the second Pfizer jab with chest pains, but I didn't tell him any of this. And at the end of the meeting, this grandee turned round to me, obviously with the party line. I've been suspended, and said that there is currently no political appetite for your views on the vaccine, Andrew. They may well be in 20 years' time, and you're probably going to be proved right. But in the meantime, you need to bear in mind you're taking on the most powerful vested interest in the world, with all the personal risk for you which that will entail. And at that point, I said, well, the meeting's over then, isn't it? Don't ever threaten me. And I don't like being threatened by public school boys. As a comprehensive school boy, if they had been at my school, they'd have spent most of their time with their head down the toilet, I can tell you. It was a very comprehensive education. So we basically called it a day at that, and then they just fast-tracked the investigation and found me guilty and permanently expelled me from the Conservative Party, which is interesting because in their investigation, what they didn't discover is I never put the tweet out myself anyway. I've never ever had the codes to my own Twitter. It was actually posted by my association chairman, who remains in the Conservative Party.
Can I ask you about? I need to ask you about the conversations with colleagues, and obviously not breaking confidence, any of that. But working with Lord Pearson, I'm always amazed people come to him after a debate and says, "Well done. I could never say that, but well done, you said that." Did you have any kind of similar?
Yes, I've probably had about over. Well, it's coming up to a year since I first spoke out. So yeah, I've probably had 30 backbenchers have come up to me and said, "You're definitely onto something with these vaccine harms. Keep going." But that's a million miles from standing in the chamber and saying anything. I've had senior members of the Conservative Party have come to me and said that they're going to speak out. I've had a very senior MP came to me before summer recess and said he'd been approached by a constituent representing 1,100 vaccine harmed people and he'd have to speak out, but he hasn't. And I had a very senior minister who came to me and said that this is all in private in Parliament, no witnesses. So, they can deny it if they want to, but you have my word, it's the truth. And come to me and said, "You do realise that my sister's just taken the Moderna booster and now she's paralysed from the neck down?" And I said, "Well, that's terrible news, but clearly you're going to have to speak out now, aren't you?" And they said, "No, well, she doesn't want any publicity and they think they're going to get her to walk again." I said, "Well, you don't have to name names. You've got to speak out, And the minister said, "I'm not speaking out," and walked off.
Wow.
And I don't know what to go. We're supposed to speak without fear or favour. I think the job of an MP is to, certainly, I see the job as being to represent the people, starting with my people in North West Leicestershire, against the government and the establishment. And now what we seem to have is a lot of MPs who represent the government and the establishment against the people. And that's an inversion of the job of a member of Parliament.
Can I?
They said to me, "Why are you willing to die on the hill of vaccine harms? Of an issue?" And I said, "Well, because that's the hill you're killing my people."
No, complete. I want to add two things to finish. One, you're in the Reclaim Party because that seemed to be the only option. Of course, you could have stood as an independent. That doesn't really happen in the UK. But also, you're continually asking the government questions. One of the latest questions is, did the MHRA inform the minister the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine had been switched? Tell us about Reclaim, and I'm assuming you're yet to receive an answer to that government question.
Well, Reclaim are a political party. They didn't have any MPs, but they're well funded and they've got some lovely premises and they've got great people, and they're also aligned with something called the Bad Law Project. So I have access to lawyers and solicitors, and so I'm taking Matt Hancock to court for defamation, and we have a very strong case. I'm probably going to take the Conservative Party to court for the way they handled my dismissal from the party, which is unbelievable. We are I'm on my 5th subject access request to the Cabinet Office. Peter, I put in for all the information they're holding on me, and even when over 4, this is the 5th one going in now, I keep cutting down the number of keywords and compressing the time. And every time they come back and I mean, they must have a library on me. They haven't got a black book. They've got a whole library on me. And every time they come back and say, it's too much work. I mean, the last one was about 10 key words. And I said, it's only from 1st of January 2017. I'll publish all the papers one day, and it'll be fascinating. But goodness knows what they're hiding. They're certainly not willing to release any documentation. So I think we're going to have a massive bust up with the government over that. And if they're doing it to me, it won't be just me, will it? There'll be, yeah. I mean, if there is any mitigation of my colleagues, and I'm loath to give them any mitigation at all for their inactivity, when so many of them, I mean, what you've got to understand, Peter, is people say to me, I said there was a lovely female Conservative MP who will remain nameless, but she was elected in 19, and she came up to me a few months ago and said, Andrew, I'm really worried about you. You know, you speak in the chamber on your own. You have all your meals on your own. You sit on your own table in the tea room and the dining room. No one talks to you. You seem really isolated. I'm really worried about you. I said, well, it's very touching. I said, but you've got to remember, there's 4,000 real people work in Parliament.
Yeah.
The cooks, the cleaners, the waiters, the security guards, the police. I said, and they all come to me, and 80% of those agree with me. So I'm not really isolated at all, am I? I said, actually, you're isolated. You just don't realise it. So it's not been that bad in Parliament. As far as the Pfizer data, it was again, Dr. Josh Gutchko sent me some from the Hebrew University, sent me some evidence, and he's not a scientist. He's a criminologist, but he's a specialist in fraud. And he went through the Pfizer papers and discovered how they'd switched the vaccines. There were 2 batches in the initial batch, one that they basically made a Rolls-Royce vaccine up, which they gave to 22,000 individuals, and they had 22,000 in the placebo group who got the saline shot. And that's what they got approval for with the MHRA and every other regulator around the world. But that wasn't the vaccine that was the Pfizer vaccine that was rolled out. And the smoking gun for the switch of the vaccines is the fact that the MHRA changed the protocols on day 2 of the mass rollout of the vaccination in the UK, and said that everyone had got to stay at the vaccine centre for 15 minutes after day 2 because of the risk of anaphylactic shock. And you only get anaphylaxis if there's endotoxins in the vaccines, and you only get endotoxins in the vaccines if they're cultured up in bacteria such as Escherichia coli. And the MHRA hadn't expected anaphylaxis because that is not how the vaccine that was given approval for was manufactured. It wasn't manufactured in bacteria with all the contaminants that would go with it. Now, you can't, to get approval for a drug, you have to use the same mechanism of production. You can't change anything, because then you've got a different drug with different side effects. So basically, what my allegation is, supported by 44 pages of evidence supplied to me by a doctor of criminology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which the government will not answer or even acknowledge, is that the vaccine that was rolled out in the UK and around the world was effectively completely untested. And it also explains why that the harms from the Pfizer trials of the very best vaccine they could make in a very small, it's basically a bespoke vaccine that they made for 22,000 doses. That was horrific enough, and that should never have had approval, but it was nothing like the harm profile we've seen in actuality through the VAERS system and the yellow card system. And the fact that the vaccine is a different vaccine basically explains that as well. If they were doing that with Pfizer, I have no doubt that Moderna are the same. And of course, I had the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was actually that bad. It was just quietly withdrawn, wasn't it? And it's interesting that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine, is not a messenger RNA. It's a DNA strand in an adenovirus vector. So it's different technology to the Pfizer and the Moderna. it's because obviously the DNA then will code for the messenger RNA, and so it's one step further back. It's interesting also that I asked for an urgent question in Parliament a few months ago because the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was withdrawn in America, and I saw the FDA, the Federal Drugs Agency guidelines, and it said stop injecting the Johnson & Johnson, and all stocks are to be destroyed.
Wow.
And the Johnson & Johnson, that was also a DNA strand, not a messenger RNA strand, and also in an adenovirus vector to get it into the cell. So it's interesting that basically both the vaccines, experimental vaccines, but using the DNA adenovirus vector method, they were both withdrawn and destroyed. But it is interesting that India are still producing effectively AstraZeneca under license. They call it Covishield in India, and of course they didn't stop the Australian version of the AstraZeneca vaccine until only a couple of months ago. So there's going to be a big kick-off there as well. So that's it. I sent it to the Attorney General because one of the questions I did ask was, did the MHRA tell the minister that they'd switched the vaccines? In which case, if they didn't, then the MHRA are guilty of potentially a crime, which is, I think it's a 2-year prison sentence and unlimited fine. But if they did tell the minister, then how could the minister go out and say they're safe, effective and tested when they knew that they weren't? I can understand why the Prime Minister doesn't want to come back to me. There isn't. I'm afraid the letter I sent him was a bit of a "Do you still beat your wife?" question.
Yeah.
There isn't a good answer, because either I'm going to nail the MHRA or I'm going to nail the ministers. And it's also interesting, I think, that so many health ministers are deciding to not stand at the next general election.
No, 100%. Andrew, I've watched your many speeches in the Commons and followed those written questions, and I think for our UK viewers and listeners who are very frustrated at UK politics, I think as long as there remains someone like you speaking this truth, then there is hope. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me on. I'm sure we'll speak again in the future.